SoundCartel.
Last episode, Evo Terra gave us pearls about how to develop a podcast strategy and plan episodes. Now he's back to discuss the best ways to grow an audience.
75% of the world, on aggregate, doesn't have the podcast habit yet. They want the content. They're happy to listen to audio. They all have a phone that has at least one, if not more, podcast listening devices in that they probably never ever use. But that represents to me the biggest opportunity for podcasting is reaching the people who have yet to listen to a show.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. And joining me once more is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hey Nick, it's great to be back with you once again.
Now, before we get to Evo, we just wanted to mention that the Podcast Academy has just launched their AMBIes, which is the new name for the Awards for Excellence in Audio.
That's right, and the Academy has chosen the word AMBIes in reference to ambient sound, which is your background sound, so things like traffic, birds, talking crowds. It's something that's often taken for granted by listeners, but in the more immersive podcast formats, it gives the audio depth and place.
So hopefully not too much ambient noise in this recording.
No, we're going to keep it to the minimum, Nick.
Now, they're holding the inaugural awards in LA on March 28th, 2021, and nominations just opened on October 19. Anyone can enter, but only members can vote. And we'll have a link in the show notes to find out more.
Fantastic. I'll see you there, Nick.
I'm not sure that will be possible, sadly, Nicole, as Australians will probably not be going overseas in March next year, but we can keep our fingers crossed.
Bugger. That's fine. I'll just Zoom in my PJs.
Okay. Now, let's get to part 2 of our chat with Evo. Last episode, he spoke about how to approach the strategy of a podcast and episode planning. So what's on the agenda today?
Yeah, this episode he's putting real meat on the bones of podcast development and talking about how to drive audience growth, which, Nick, as we know, is a crucial step in the process. So just to recap, Evo is the host with the most of Podcast Pontifications, a go-to resource for anyone in the industry.
Welcome back again, Evo, to Podcasting Essentials.
It feels like it was just a few minutes ago, but really it's been like 7 minutes ago. No, whatever the number has been. It's been great.
Now, in the previous episode, we have perfected our podcast strategy and we've planned for a successful episode or episodes. But jumping forward now, we've produced some episodes and it's time to grow an audience of engaged listeners. But before we start promoting our podcast, you have 3 things that we must master first. What are those 3 things?
You know, the idea of promoting a podcast is everybody would like to do it, and they want to do it as fast as physically possible. But as I try and tell people, well, make sure you're not going to waste any money, I guess is the way to do that. You don't want to throw good money after bad, as we have said previously. So the 3 things I recommend any podcaster, whether it's a business podcaster or hobbyist podcaster, do before they start spending any cash whatsoever is 3 things. Number 1, make sure you have the fundamentals down right. You have to have a solid foundation, because if you don't, you are just going to waste money. And what I mean by that is a few different things. 1, you need a home for your podcast. And the home for your podcast isn't its listing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon. That's not what I mean. You need a home, a web presence for your podcast. And that probably means a website. And it likely means a nice website that works really, really well and really communicates and conveys to people who you are and what it's all about. So make sure your web presence is good. Second thing is you have to ensure you have complete distribution of your podcast. Way too many people say, well, Apple Podcasts makes up 60 or 70% of the numbers. I'll just put it there. Wrong. New podcast directories are coming on the scene all the time. In the last month, we've had, 2 giant ones from the subcontinent of India that have now come on board with Amazon Music, just happening a few weeks ago that's come on board. You need to make sure your podcast is everywhere, because as new people into the space, we have no idea how they're going to listen. We just want to make sure that it's everywhere we need it to be, including all of our own internal stuff, right? Our website, or we have a newsletter, or we're already talking to customers that way. Can we talk to them? So let's get it out of there. So those are the things for getting the foundation making sure the fundamentals of all that are right. That's step one. Make sure you've got something that is worth doing, number one. The second thing is what I call remarkable content. I'm a big fan of old adages from the advertising world, and there's one that is my favorite, that is, advertising is a tax on the unremarkable. Now, I love that because it really sums up what I feel about advertising whatsoever. And it's the same thing for podcasting. Look, if you're not making content that people want to talk about and people want to share, if there's nothing unique and special about what you are doing, it's just meh, why would anybody want to listen? I wouldn't want to drive a lot of traffic to a podcast that is not anything exciting. People are just going to go, well, that was a waste of my time. Move on. Not a good thing. Third thing you have to do before you start promoting is leverage your existing network. And if you're a business, that means your consumers, your customers. I talked about a mailing list previously in the first one. Are you reaching out to all of them? You already have all these people that are talking to you on a regular basis through your stores or through your salespeople or whatever. Are they engaged? What can you do over there? What about the people that you have subscribed to a newsletter, perhaps, for your business? Are you letting them know about your podcast? What are the superpowers that you have as a business, and how can you leverage those first? So 3 things to recap. Make sure the foundations are right. Make sure you're making remarkable content. And third, leverage your existing network.
But Evo, you can't grow what you don't know. So how important is it to understand your audience before you start amplifying your podcast?
Hugely important to understand your audience before you even start making content. Really. How do you know what you want people to listen to? How do you know who they are? So one of the very first things when you start planning your podcast, who am I talking to? Quite often, I'm sure you have both heard it as well, we say, well, I want to talk to everybody, which means you're talking to no one, right? You don't define who it is. You've got to set your avatar. You've got to really understand who your focus is going to be. And once you understand those people and what they're looking for, that's when you can start crafting content specific to them, which is good to begin the process. And once you've got a good, I hate to use the startup-y term, but I will, product market fit, once you know that's actually working, then you can go to figure out, well, where else are these people? What's my lookalike audience out there? Where can I find more people that are just like who I've made this podcast for? That's a smart play.
So then off the back of that, what are the best ways to grow an audience?
I think it depends on what it is we're trying to do. When we think about to grow an audience, right? Assume we've got all the foundations, all the fundamental stuff is done, and we've already leveraged our network. It really comes down to what do we think is going to give us the best bang for our buck? And there are a lot of things we can try. When you boil it down, podcast marketing is just content marketing, which is just marketing. It's about reaching your consumers. But I don't want to leave you with that little answer. The things that tend to work pretty well for podcasters to grow their audience, even businesses with podcasters, are pretty standard things that people just don't think of a lot. Number one is make sure you're getting exposure on other podcasts in your niche, not just every podcast everywhere, but make sure that you're making your presence known on other shows. That's borrowing somebody else's audience. You're providing great content because you're a guest on their program or a guest contributor. It's a definite way for you to let other people who are already interested in podcasting, number one, and your content know that you exist. They may eventually want to listen to your show. That's one good way to do things. I'm also a big fan of developing a network effect. Even if you're alone and your business is your only podcast and you don't have a network of 15, 20 shows to run, you can kind of build your own network effect by working directly with other podcasts that are out there or working with other businesses who are just starting your podcast. And you can share information back and forth, share an audience back and forth, promote and communicate with other podcasters who are in your same area. Just a rising tide lifts all boats. But if you really want a successful way to do it, there's a concept called an episode drop. If you're the Wonderies of the world or somebody else, you've got this established podcast and we haven't put an episode of Serial out since November of 2018. However, we have made a new podcast and around 14.7 million people are still subscribed to this one. Let's drop it over there. So you can do that if you have your own network. But what you can also do is you can rent that from other podcasts. It's something that you can buy. So if you're a business and you have a budget for marketing, and you need a budget for marketing, one of the most effective ways to do that is look at doing episode drops. That can quickly accelerate your podcast up the charts.
Fantastic idea.
We all know SEO is super important if you want to get discovered on the internet, but it's hard work. So for podcasting, is it worth the effort?
Absolutely. I mean, SEO, search engine optimization, is how people still find things, right? Word of mouth is popular. It's probably one of the biggest ways podcasts get discovered, but every day more people go type something into a search box somewhere than anywhere else. And Google will use them as the proxy for every other search engine because they kind of are the proxy for every other search engine. They're indexing all sorts of web content, podcasts and podcast episodes included. A great amount of the podcast discovery isn't really happening inside the apps, although to a certain degree there are inside of Apple Podcasts and Spotify, but the vast majority comes from search engines and optimizing your content so that it shows up when someone is searching for something of relevance is super important. But as you said, Nick, it's hard. It's really hard work, and that's typically because most people think about SEO as an afterthought. All right, I've developed this content. I got my podcast episode. Here's my episode details and my show notes, my blog post. Now, SEO person, SEO this. But that's nothing new to podcasting. We used to run marketing departments, and we had big SEO teams, and that's what every client said to us. Here's my website. Here's my content. SEO it. And that's not the way it works. The way it works for search engine optimization is you start with, what is someone searching for? Before I've created a lick of content, what is someone searching for and what do I have to offer? Making content that matches a search term, and not in a very narrow design just to try and get traffic sort of way where you do stupid things like buyhouserealnow.com, stupid dumb things like that, which are just horrible tricks. No, but I mean, just understand, if you want to make content for people who are searching, start with the search. Start with the search terms themselves and the queries and understand what the human behavior is. What are they looking for? Make content for that. Once you've done that, that's the hard work. The hard work is all done because now it's a matter of, okay, this is the phrase I'm going to be going for. This is the search term. I'm going to plan an episode out around that. I'm going to write a title that has that inside of it. I'm going to be sure that I mention it, all the little stuff that goes in. But you've really built a piece of content that is for that one phrase. That will probably be all you need to do for that one phrase. And then, of course, you got to do it again and again and again. And everything that you do has to go back to that. So yes, definitely. SEO is a super important thing, but make sure you're approaching it the right way. Put that at the front before you create the content.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to mention that in the previous episode, we talked about planning, and that's another place, obviously, where SEO is so important. What other tips do you have for doing SEO for a podcast well?
So don't only think about SEO as Google. And don't think about SEO only as people who are going to a dedicated internet search engine to type something. A lot of discovery does take place inside of the apps. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and it's a little bit of a black box. We don't know a lot about what goes into there, but we do know some things. They're all doing it slightly different. So you want to make sure that the things that you think are working well for SEO actually are. For example, a little known secret about Apple Podcasts is that the only fields that matter when returning search results is the title and the author field. That's it. So if you're spending all this time writing really cool summaries and amazing detailed information inside of your episode details, none of that's used for search discovery inside of Apple Podcasts. So make sure that the name of your hosts, along with the name of the company that produces the show, are in the author field. If anybody wants to search for the author's name, podcast by this particular person, they're going to type that name. Will it show up? Who knows? Will it actually show up or not? Probably not if you haven't done that. So make sure that you're understanding. And again, like I said, it's a black box. We don't know what those things are. So go try things. Go to those various apps and search for your name. Search for the content, for topic, and see what's coming up. See if your stuff is coming up. Hopefully it is. If it's not, do a little bit of an investigation and kind of put your sleuth hat on and figure out what needs to be changed.
So the title then is super important.
Gigantically.
How long could or should a title be?
Yeah, standard rules apply for title length, and that is there's not really a practical limit on how long it can be. But it's pretty easy to see when a title has been stuffed with keywords. That's very easy, and you will get kicked out of Apple in a moment when you try and do that. It's also important to make sure that you put the most important stuff up front. So whatever it's about, make sure that those keywords are as close to the front as you possibly can. I spend a lot of time using headline and analytics tools to come up with titles. It's probably one of the things I spend the most time on for my show because I have weird topics anyhow, but I will spend a lot. I'll write 5 or 6 different headlines until I find the one that I think is really going to capture the most. So yeah, those things are super important. I wouldn't worry too much about length, but think about it from the point of view as what's a really good title? You can use 80 characters if you want, that's fine, but you can probably get it done around 50 is a guess. There's not a really hard and fast rule, just don't try and stuff it. And also make sure that it's relevant. If you write a title that it matches a search term perfectly and the content down below doesn't match, that's also spamming, and you'd be caught for doing that pretty quickly.
Evo, are there specific keyword search tools that you use or recommend? There's a lot out there.
Yeah, there are a lot of tools out there. Unfortunately, we don't have any that will give insight into what's being searched on various podcast apps yet. I always hear rumors about something like that happening, and they don't exist. But I typically rely just on the tools that Google provides as part of their suite of products. It's designed primarily for advertising, but you can still get some good understanding. I get a lot of information. Probably my favorite tool to use for my own SEO work is Search Console, which used to be called Google Webmaster Tools. I get more value out of Search Console because it shows me what terms my content is already showing up for. Maybe 30, 50 pages deep in Google, but it's already got some juice for it. So my number one term for the last few weeks has been, "Sir, this is a Wendy's," which is weird. But I did a whole article because, Wendy's had put a podcast out not long ago, which was very dumb. And I did a whole episode about it, why I thought it was kind of brilliant, maybe in a weird way of looking at it. That became my most popular search term. I'm like ranked number 3. If you type in, "Sir, this is a Wendy's," I'm like number 3, which is really, really weird, right? To have those things. But you can use that Search Console tool to really understand what is coming on right now, what's already happening, and then ways you can make small adjustments to see if you can boost that up in the ranks.
Now, Evo, being in the industry, we can forget that not everyone listens to podcasts yet. What can we do to target podcast novices or new listeners without cannibalizing our existing audience?
Boy, I'm glad you brought that up, Nicole, because 75% of the world, on aggregate, doesn't have the podcast habit yet. They want the content. They're happy to listen to audio. They all have a phone that has at least one, if not more, podcast listening devices in that they probably never ever use. But that represents to me the biggest opportunity for podcasting is reaching the people who have yet to listen to a show. And you asked the question, what can you do to attract those people without alienating your audience? I don't think they do alienate the audience at all. I think they can go hand in hand. I think if you're making really good content that people want to consume, your regular listeners will want to listen, as well as the people who have yet to listen to podcasting. And the best thing we can do if we're trying to reach new listeners who haven't listened to podcast is make sure that their very first experience with our podcast is amazing. It sounds great. The quality is top-notch. It was good information. We've got nice detailed episode notes in the event that they do want to get more information, that we've really focused on the listener experience. I coined a phrase that's called, you want people to have an INI moment, an IHNI. And that stands for, I had no idea. I want someone, when they listen to an episode that I recommended them, not necessarily of my show, but if I'm going to recommend to someone who says, I've always heard about podcasting, but I've never actually done it. I have a list that I keep on its totally separate podcast app that's got 15 amazing sounding podcasts. And I give that to them. Well, back when we used to exchange earbuds, we wouldn't do that anymore. But I would tell them, pull this up on your phone and listen, because they're going to listen and they're going to say, wow, I had no idea that's what podcasting could sound like. That's the message I think we need to get out there. Let's make sure we're recommending amazing content to people that will turn them into converted podcast listeners.
So to finish, Evo, our audience is growing, hopefully. What are the metrics now that matter? Or is it really the intangibles that should be of most importance to brands?
Hey, I think if you're a brand and you've got business outcomes that you're tracking to, that you are trying to increase sales or you're trying to get more initial phone calls with customers or whatever, clearly your business outcomes trump any sort of metric we have internally to podcasting. So that's first and foremost. Let's make sure your business metrics are being hit and that you can measure them, you can track them back into the podcast itself, whether it's attribution or through tagging or through some other clever way to do that. You've got to make sure you do that. But The podcast community, we have a dependency on tracking downloads. And downloads to me are worthless because a download is a computer talking to another computer, not necessarily even initiated by a human being. Downloads mean absolutely nothing. What we care about is listens. Did people actually listen to the content that we have? And so when tracking show growth, if you want to track, I'd like to get double the number of downloads I got last month. That's easy. Produce double the number of episodes. There you go. We just did it. Didn't grow a single person. We didn't do that. We're starting to see some companies, like I use Captivate.fm as my hosting company. Disclosure, I'm on their advisory board as well. Captivate is now providing a unique listeners over time. Just like if you're an app developer, if you listen to people talking about app developers, they talk about monthly active users. Monthly active user means somebody who has used that app at least one time during the month. Do you know what your monthly active user for Podcasting Essentials is? No, you don't, right? Because we just don't have that number, but we can get that number. Some podcast hosts do report that, and they'll do it at a 7-day window, a 14-day window, 28-day window. Just like Google Analytics will tell you what the active users were on your site over this 14-day period, some host will get that. That, to me, is the number we should be caring about. Because if I'm a brand, do I care that you're a subscriber? Clearly, I want you to subscribe to my content, but there are a huge number of people out there who will never subscribe to a podcast, who never have, who listen to episodes all day long, but they do not subscribe to podcasts. So that can't be the number. What about the people who listen to an episode and it's so great, they listen to episode 5 or 6 times? That's not captured by looking at a download. What if they share it with somebody? We don't have those things. So to me, I think if we had an active user graph that we could look at over time and see how we're growing. If I'm at 10,000 active users for 14 days this month, what was I last month? Did I grow that number? That's a better measurement, I think, to reach and how we're really, truly growing an audience.
Evo, your insights are so spot on. Thank you for taking the time. You're an absolute gem. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Evo. Let's not make it 2 years this time.
Right. Let's see if we can not have a global pandemic or other things in the middle that interrupt with these things, and we'll make it happen again. So, well, thanks again for having me on.
We've often talked, Nicole, on this podcast about the importance of thinking about your marketing and growing your audience right back at the very start of the process.
Yes.
And also that the marketing should be considered to be at least 50% of the workload.
Absolutely. It's a huge amount of work and commitment. And that's where we often say, if you're not going to be able to sustain the consistency, don't start or think about it and plan right up front.
Now, Evo's fundamentals that he mentioned at the start, I could not agree with more.
Yeah.
Having a good website for your podcast is critically important and definitely something, again, that you should be thinking about at the start of the process. Be developing the website and those assets at the same time as developing the audio. Don't leave it till you're about to launch. You go, oh, quick, I need a website, because it won't be done properly.
No, as I've said before on the show, that the website really does need to be the single source of truth. Absolutely think about the show itself, but also keep in mind the website and where it's going to be housed and where you're going to send people in every single piece of communication.
And your distribution plan, make sure that you are everywhere.
Yes.
And that's changing all the time. For example, Amazon Music didn't have podcasts only a few weeks ago, and now they do. And that's a huge source of audience for you. So keep on top of all those distribution points at all times. A fairly obvious one to us is make remarkable content.
Yeah.
And that's nothing new. In fact, if you're not going to start off with the goal of it being remarkable, then I would say don't bother.
Don't do it, yeah.
I did like his innie. That wasn't a term I'd heard before, apart from when referring to a belly button.
Exactly.
But that notion of I had no idea, giving people something that blows their mind a little bit is always good. I think Oprah's now quite well known for her aha moments, but it's actually something that my dad, when he founded this business back in the 80s, was one of his premises that every interview we did for Business Essentials, and we still do today for Business Essentials, must have an aha moment. And that's where a business owner who's listening says, aha, I can do that in my business. So it's more than just nice to know information, it's must know information.
Yeah.
And again, that's going to keep your listeners coming back over and over again. And the last one was leveraging existing customers. And that comes back to something that, Nicole, you're very passionate about in the marketing stage, which is getting on top of your owned media.
Yeah, for a lot of businesses, you already have a cultivated audience there that you might not even realise through your databases, your email newsletters, your social media followers, any customers you might have, prospects, they're there. They're waiting for you. You already send them information. Don't forget about them when you're promoting your podcast.
And like I said last episode, it all comes back to planning.
Sure does.
In fact, the 6 Ps of planning, as I'm sure our listeners have heard before, proper planning and preparation prevents poor performance. It's worth keeping in mind.
It is worth keeping in mind. Much better than plan from last episode. The other point, Nick, is that not all discoverability happens inside the podcast apps themselves. A lot happens outside. So when you're Googling, in your digital marketing, any PR, you have to make sure that you cover all of those bases as well.
Yeah, but for the inside app promotion, I'd heard it before, but I was reminded, and it still surprises me, that Apple is only searching the title and the author field. And I don't know what other apps are doing, but it seems crazy to not search the description or show notes as well. But anyway, that seems to be how it is. So it does mean for those people that are inside the apps, the title is so important.
Crucial. And again, Nick, the other thing we talk a lot about is understanding who your audience is. You can't even think about growing your listenership until you understand who they are, where do they live, where do they consume content. Absolutely critical to know this right up front.
And where to find them. Because, as Evo said, there are more potential listeners to your podcast that are not currently listening to podcasts, potentially.
Yes, 75%.
So what are the best ways to find them?
I think it's about using the breadth of the content opportunities that are available, and that includes things like audiograms, so short videos promoting a podcast episode for social media. Social media itself is a great tool. Also, audience targeting. Evo spoke a little bit about narrowing down your target audience and then creating lookalike audiences too. That's a really helpful way that Facebook in particular helps you target audiences.
And we know word of mouth is a huge driver of discoverability of podcasts.
Yeah, word of mouth is the number one way people discover new podcasts, and that can't be underestimated. So being able to collaborate and promote your podcast in a comparable show is a great way to grow your reach and have a new set of ears hear about your podcast.
And even for non-podcast listeners, if a friend of theirs is listening to a podcast and hear a show that they think will be of relevance, then they might pass that on via word of mouth.
Exactly.
I guess with word of mouth, you can't go around telling people one at a time, so you've just got to keep finding ways to broadcast your message to as many people in your target audience as possible.
That's right. And at this stage in the game, new listeners are unlikely to be drawn to content that isn't worth listening to. And what I mean by that is quality of sound. Comes back to that ability to plan and make sure that you produce the show to the best of your ability. Quality sound, remarkable content.
Absolutely. A great point to finish. And that is all we have time for on this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
Thank you, Nick, for having me.
To find out more about how we can help you create a podcast, check out our website at soundcartel.com.au or on the socials at SoundCartelAU. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening now. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.
SoundCartel.